Hello, these are flip notes 0.4 on research methods. We're still in unit 0 on the scientific foundations of psychology and research methods. Let's get started.
So there are three main types of research. We've got descriptive or observational, where we're really just observing and describing behaviors, looking for patterns. Correlation, we're finding the relationship between two specific variables. And then experimental research, where we're actually trying to control, manipulate variables, and to determine causation. Today, we're focusing on observational. In psychology, we do use a scientific method. I'm not going to go in depth in this because I'm pretty sure every science class you've ever had, you have gone in depth. But same steps with asking a question, forming a hypothesis, experiment, observe and record, draw conclusion, and sharing your findings. So the scientific approach does believe that events, including behaviors, are governed by some lawful order. Our goals are to measure, describe, understand, predict, and then ultimately to try to apply and control. So, to figure out if we're trying to determine what causes anxiety, how do we measure anxiety? How would we describe anxiety? Understand and predict when anxiety happens. And then ultimately, can we learn to control anxiety? When forming theories, we start with an actual idea. We form a hypothesis. We have to conduct empirical research. When that research is good, it builds confidence in our theories. If it doesn't, the confidence decreases. We either discard the theory or we revise it and we start all over again. Some different ways that we collect data in psychology. I'm not going to read everything here, but through direct observations where we are actually observing and watching people or animals. They might use some kind of instrumentation and a stopwatch, but really just like observing behaviors through a questionnaire or a survey, through direct interviews, through a psychological test, maybe an intelligence test, a personality test, through physiological recordings. So that might mean measuring heart rate, blood pressure, brain waves, and then looking at archival records, which basically means any other kind of data that somebody else has already collected, such as census info, grades, educational records, medical records, anything else that's already out there. Once a person does conduct research and they have findings, it's important for them to share them into scientific journals so that others can benefit from that research. Let's see, the advantages of the scientific method are that they create clarity of communication and hopefully it's more resistant to errors. An important part of the sharing of scientific articles is the peer review process. The idea that before you really publish something, like let's say I have conducted a study, I have found a new medication that is going to treat anxiety and it's going to be the cure to all of anxiety. But before I publish my results, I need to ask other professionals in my field to evaluate my study, that my research seems sound and reliable, that my conclusions are valid. So it's to ensure that there is going to be reliable findings. Now, if my study involved actually conducting an experiment, which if it was about a medication, that would require what we call a double-blind experiment. More about that later. But I would need other people to repeat my experiment or replicate it to make sure that they get the same results, that maybe this one time I did the experiment, it cured 2 people with anxiety. Well, can other people replicate my experiment and have the same findings? That's a really important part of the peer review process, but today in research, a lot of people who conduct research are finding that they have a problem getting enough experiments to be replicated, and that's because of the way people acquire research funding. That you want to be the first one to make a big discovery. And you're not going to be the one who gets all the attention, and attention equals more funding for being the 4th person to replicate a study, unless you replicate it and you find out that it was wrong, and then maybe you can publish something about that. But experiment replication, an important part of the process that's kind of being struggled with lately. All right, so getting into the actual types of research. So again, these are descriptive or correlational methods that we're looking at today, and they're really just looking for relationships. So the key thing here is that with all of these methods, the researcher cannot manipulate the variables. They can't control what is happening in the study. They can only observe the results. So we cannot determine causation here. So for example, we can't determine that something like this, chemical in the brain causes anxiety. This is not an experiment. Instead, we can observe behaviors and make connections about patterns and then theorize about different ways to do things that could change their behaviors. The first of these is naturalistic observation. And it's pretty much what it sounds like, observing things, people or humans, in their natural setting. The key thing here is that the animals or people, whatever the subject is, cannot know they're being observed. So the most common example of this, and I'll come back to that. Pause. Naturalistic observations, they're valuable, whereas other methods can be more disruptive. So the problem is that if people know that they're being observed, they tend to act differently. They're going to be on their best behavior. They're going to do their job the very best they could, different than they normally would. But the other problem is that ethically, you're supposed to tell people if you're observing them. If somebody is in a study, they're supposed to know. So how do you tell them they're in a study without them knowing that you're observing them? So it's a little bit difficult. The observations can be distorted if observers expect to see certain behaviors. If, for example, if I'm looking for a certain behavior, like I'm looking for how many times you smiled, and I'm like, oh, I think that was a smile, but maybe it wasn't really. That kind of can affect the results. Um, so we might have to really accurately define what would be a smile, what's considered a smile. The most famous or classic example for naturalistic observations, they always like to put in textbooks, is Jane Goodall. And we're going to watch a clip about her in class. But Jane Goodall studied chimps in the wild. She actually wasn't a scientist. She was more, she worked for National Geographic magazine. So that was one reason people scrutinized her, that she wasn't actually a scientist. But she actually got out into the jungles of Africa and observed chimps. And she noticed things about the way they behave, that they can use tools, about when they were aggressive or nurturing to each other. And she did this pretty much her whole life. She's still around. She's up there in age, but she's still a huge advocate for preserving habitats for animals. But the reason it's a problem, though, that she's considered a naturalist, or that she's a classic example for naturalistic observation, is that frequently the chimps knew she was there. Over time, they got used to her and they didn't care. In fact, they loved her. But in a true naturalistic observation setting, the people are not supposed to know that they are being observed. All right, our next type is a case study. This is where we are gathering a large amount of information about a specific subject. So an intense examination of behavior, mental processes. It's difficult, though, to generalize that information across larger populations. So we have the example in class with Jim Fallon, who studied serial killers. So he gathered a lot of information. He studied their educational records, their prison records, any kind of foster records, any kind of information about them, and was able to draw conclusions about patterns in their behavior and that they had common childhood histories, and that was probably a contributing factor to their criminal behaviors and their mental, the way their brain processed relationships. But that information can't be generalized to the whole population. It's really only specific to that group of people. Sigmund Freud used case studies. He studied the people that he studied himself, for one. He was his own biggest case study, but he also studied a few people that he was treating. And then he generalized their behaviors to everybody. So sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. It's useful, though, when something is new. So, for example, when there's a rare disease, that nobody really knows a whole lot about. So you want to try to find a few people or as many people as you can who have that rare disease and gather as much info about it. But that info is not going to necessarily apply to everybody. It's just going to apply to everybody else who has that same problem. So some limitations: it may contain evidence that a certain researcher thought to be important, but maybe it wasn't really important. It's unlikely to be representative of people in general, but we still get information about these individuals, and that might help us to figure something else out later on. So it provides viable information for further research, and it can serve as testing ground for new treatments, training programs, and other applications of research. Our next method are surveys. A survey gathers self-reported attitudes, opinions, behaviors by questioning people, generally a representative or random sample of people. And we'll go more into detail about representative and random samples. They, allow research to describe patterns of behavior, look for links, but again, we can't imply causation just from a survey. The best thing about a survey is that you can gather data from a large number of people. It could be, everybody at Red Oak High School. It could be everybody in the United States with the census. So you can gather a large amount of data fairly easily. It can be used as part of an operational definition within an experiment, which we'll talk about those in the next part. So for example, if we're doing an experiment on the impact of wearing rainbow-colored socks on happiness, how would you measure happiness? You could give them a survey. The survey in the picture down here comes from the census. But the problem with a survey is that they can be vulnerable to different types of bias. So for example, in a social desirability bias, this has to do with how people answer the questions, that maybe people don't answer honestly, they want to answer in a way that makes them sound like a better person. So if it's a question about drugs, have you ever done drugs? And they think their teacher is going to read the survey. Are they going to be honest on that survey? What about a survey that asks, how much money do you give to charity every year? Oh, I give a ton of money to charity. People especially if it's not sure that it's anonymous, they may not be honest that they don't give much to others. There could be a sampling bias in that maybe they only survey a certain group of people. If I wanted to survey students of Red Oak High School and find out what percentage of students from Red Oak High School plan to go on to a four-year university, and I only give that survey to students in my AP psychology classes, that could be skewed. That would be a sampling bias because that is not representative of all the students at Red Oak High School. I would think that quite a few students in an AP class want to go on to a four-year college. But what about students in regular classes who may plan to go to a trade school or the military, or they just don't want to go to college at all? Another bias is a response set. This is when people tend to just answer the same way to every question. So this goes with questions where they might say, do you agree, disagree, strongly disagree? Maybe you're in a hurry, so you just put agree on everything. So that's not going to help us get valid results. So more problems with survey. The validity depends on how well the question was worded. What if the question was confusing? And again, that representativeness of the people who are surveyed. Other problems: willingness of people to honestly complete the survey. And people may say what they believe they're supposed to say, what they want people to hear, but it might not be accurate. So doing a great survey, you can get a lot of data, but a lot of effort needs to be put into making a good survey. So again, the biggest benefit, still a great way to gather large amounts of information.
All right, the next research method that we're going to discuss is a meta-analysis. When I hear meta-analysis, I think mega-analysis, because what we're doing here is combining results from different studies to find patterns among study results. It could be combining surveys that have been completed at multiple high schools, or it could be multiple people who've done the same experiments, but maybe from different countries or in different states or at different universities. So when they do this, they're going to be able to gather more quantitative research and data to look at the statistics. It's going to give us better evidence to support a study. It enables researchers to find more solid conclusions based on the evidence, especially if they're getting the same results. And it allows the accuracy of the effect estimate to be better, that they have really tried this out multiple times. So meta-analysis can also help to replicate experiments. Here we have an example of some research where the same research was done in different states. So in the left one, the results might only be applicable to specific types of individuals, but in the next one on the right, because they did it in multiple states, they can say that their results are more generalizable. Another example here described in this study, and this one was about a meta-analysis of depression and substance use and impairment among cocaine users. So the hypothesis is that drug and alcohol use is associated with depression and serious impairments. And that's a pretty common assumption that those go together. So in this meta-analysis, they looked at 60 studies that were similar, and they found support for their hypothesis. So that was able to make more conclusions of things that support their hypothesis. Our next section here are on biases that may occur in research. The hindsight bias is known as the I knew it all along phenomenon. This is our tendency that once we know the results of something, we believe that we would have known those results before the outcome. So examples of that would be things like 9/11, that a lot of people said after 9/11 happened and the towers were struck and all these terrorist things happened that, oh, we knew that was going to happen. But no, we didn't. Another example is when students make test corrections, they often come in, they see the right answer, and they say, oh, I knew that, but you didn't, or else you would have picked that. So we often think we knew something, but not until we hear the result do we actually know it. A confirmation bias is our tendency to only look for information that confirms our point of view. So for example, a person who might be a Republican who only chooses to listen to a news station that tends to be more conservative because it'll support their point of view, an Obama fan or a Democrat who only looks for the good that former president has done and ignores the bad. And if a teacher believes that girls score better than boys, she might just look at the girls who scored higher. Overconfidence is another one, and this happens a lot in real life, but we think we know more than we actually do. A lot of times it has to do with timing. In one study, they asked people ahead of time how long they thought it would take them to do a bunch of anagrams or little word mix-up puzzles. And they all said it would take them just a few seconds, about 10 seconds, but on average, it would take them about 3 minutes. How often have you thought, I'm going to finish my homework in about 30 minutes, and an hour and a half later, you're still there? So overconfidence, we often tend to overestimate our own abilities.